Hello, how are we all? Welcome to the first in a series I'm calling Making Up History, a series where I talk about history whilst putting my makeup on. For the first episode, I thought I'd do something that I keep on getting drawn back into, and it's going through the 1960s. Something about the 60s just really fascinates me. It's something that if I get the choice in an essay question and there's something that relates to the 60s, I am there, I am doing it. Um, I first covered the 60s when I was in year 10 doing my GCSEs. I did it as my coursework. And again, it came up in my first year of university and again in my second year. Basically, anytime I want to revisit it, I can do, which has been quite nice because, as I said, it's just like such a melting pot of ideas. Weeks called it the transitioning periods between old and new norms. Like, there's so much to talk about within it, and also like good music and fashion and all the easy stuff in history that I can just look back on and like. But also the difficult parts of history which you need to talk about in order to understand society today. So it really does encapsulate a lot of what I look for in a historical topic to find personally interesting. I like history as a way to conceptualize the world, and the 1960s does that. A lot of the decisions that was made then or why they were made still very much impacts our lives today, and again, also just like fun music and that. So the question So the question I'm going to be centering this video on is, can we consider this swinging 60s swinging? Basically, there was a very famous front cover on the Times of Swinging London. The decade is normally called the swinging 60s. It's quite a famous term to describe the decade as. When I learned it both at school and at university, normally it's centred around this question of whether the decade can be swinging. Looks back on fondly, lots of nostalgia, a lot of quite key, as I said, Weeks called it the transitioning period, and I think that's a very good way to describe it because it was a change and it transformed society. And from just like a normal look, you can view it as changing it to be swinging. However, that question, with everything in history, there are more complications. And then I'm going to also end by questioning the notion of giving a time period an adjective or like a descriptive term in order to encapsulate the entire feeling of the decade, whether that is useful to us. So we're going to be focusing on Britain because that's what I know more about, and I feel like to cover issues in like America, Northern Ireland, obviously the decolonisation that was happening around the world would warrant a very long video and a lot of in-depth examining. I don't think it'd do justice to do everything in one big video. And the way it was posited to me when I first started learning is that, is the swinging 60s swinging? Yes, because Beatles, no, because Kes. Since then I've learned a bit more nuance within that, but like with everything, yes and no is kind of the answer. So let's first look at social attitudes. It's kind of posited that the period was a lot more free and liberal, and that was part of the social attitudes of the decade. But whether that is true is obviously another question. It'd be wrong to say it was entirely false. I think I like quite looking at fashions and music and what was seen at the time. What is popular kind of does imply what attitudes were in and what people generally felt. What the extent people felt is obviously a broader question that will be very individualised. But the fact that the Beatles' music was popular, the fact that Twiggy epitomised this lifestyle that was deemed to be good enough to be put on the front cover of a magazine, like that's all significant. And when you see how it's changed from the 1950s especially, it does kind of imply what the swinging attitudes of Britain was like at the time. Before, pin-up girls would be more not afraid of sex. If you look at pictures, they were almost not wanting sex. They were sexy in a not wanting sex kind of way. 60s, you see this transitioning into women looking like they want sex, which kind of goes with the period of female liberation, and again the social attitudes of what people want in a sex partner. In terms of fashion, there were fashion trends that were seen to be out there, like the miniskirt, but they became a staple, and obviously not everybody was involved in it, but as a society, it was something that was being embraced. Definitely something, even if you didn't want to participate within it yourself, it was something that other people can do. However, historians like Mort suggest that there was a strong sense of conservatism still within Britain during the 1960s. I think there can be a wider shift away of ideology without people participating in that ideology. And Mort seems to suggest that if people were okay with it, it didn't mean they were doing it themselves. And I think that is true from research that I have done. I think people still waited until marriage to have sex. I don't think being out and gay was anywhere tolerated as much as what I was considered to be acceptable. Donnelly also notes that if people were more in favour of letting other people choose their own morality. So they didn't necessarily agree with the swinging trajectory of the 60s, but it was more of a, yeah, you can choose to do this if you want to go to hell. But it's more, it should be an individual choice. Research I did on youth culture, there was a sense that when you are young, you should be able to, I don't know, be a bit more free, and the introduction of the pill, etc., wasn't used, and it wasn't even allowed to be with single women. It was more that you can get married and then not have children straight away and enjoy being young for a bit, but it still was a heavy emphasis on getting married and being in a relationship. You can't just sleep around. That's not what the pill's there for, but the pill is there, which is a change and a new development that hadn't been felt in any other generation. It obviously means you can be a bit more swinging, but not enough to warrant the title, in my opinion. Also, just as someone who is from Yorkshire, I do have to point out that the miners were still the lowest paid workers anywhere in a Western developed country, and films like Kes again shows that the swinging version of London was absolutely not universal. I mean, we can all assume that, but in terms of social attitudes, some places did feel more conservative motivations more than other places, but it's not just as simple as like a scale. I feel like there's lots of like different trajectories from that. For example, in mining communities, there are more traditional gender norms, but not in the same way. Like women tend to be in charge of the money because pragmatism plays a role in these norms. And this leads us on to the legislation. Another point where if people say the period is swinging, then they look at the Liberal legislation. And to be fair, a lot of landmark Liberal legislation was passed during the 1960s. At the start of the decade, there was a trial surrounding Lady Chatterley's lover, which had people hooked. But apparently it's not as good as a book as what the scandal surrounding it would have you believe. But basically there was a book and it was not allowed to be published. I think it's from the 1920s actually, because there was a bit of a sex scene, and there was a big, very well documented and it's sensationalized trial of whether this book should be allowed to be in print. And there were some people, mainly men, older men, I think one of them was like, we can't have these book lying around for the maids to see. God, what if they get ideas? And that was one side. But the trial ended with the court ruling that this book should be allowed to be in print, which opened up ways of exploring and discussing sex and other issues that were seen to be so taboo before. Well, whether they were seen to be taboo is a very different thing to whether the law and certain members of society saw them to be taboo. But basically, you can now read this book, so that opened the way for other areas to be talked about. There was a very famous book, God, I can't remember the name of it, I'll put it on, discussing young women having sex. So there was more freedom in literacy, which obviously then leads into social attitudes. You can expand your ideas on social attitudes if you can read more about it. Also, the abolition of the also the abolition of capital punishment was oversaw during the decade. Also, the decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967 was also um, part of this liberal legislation. But as Donnelly notes, permissive laws does not equate to a permissive state. When the decriminalisation of homosexuality occurred, when it passed through court, Roy Jenkins likened them to people with disabilities who were crippled by this unfortunate affliction that they have, and they should be free to try and seek help for it. So, although obviously decriminalisation of homosexuality is a good thing, the way in which it was decriminalised does not imply a swinging state. As previously stated, you can be in favour of having a permissive state and letting people choose, but does not necessarily mean that you yourself believe in those measures. It's more that you believe in freedom and people's right to choose. This is the era of the Cold War, and Britain was becoming a bit more Americanised with their ideas on liberalism. In terms of their ideas of freedom, they very much were in contrast with communism in the USSR, and I think ramping up freedoms in states in terms of the law was a way to say that, look, capitalism is good. So with these two ideas, let's now look at women. The fight for equal civil rights and the women's marches are synonymous with the 60s, so important part and a very important development that very much still impacts our lives today. As I've said, the pill was introduced, so in theory more sexual freedom and liberation was available to people. Abortions were made legal. The divorce laws made getting a divorce a whole lot easier. However, with these developments, again, there are kind of what they call little star things you need to look into. And it's not just like a wholeheartedly good thing. For example, abortions were only allowed if 2 GPs deemed it in the interest of somebody's health to get rid of the child. Now, what this means can vary from GP to GP. Some would argue that a young girl who doesn't want to have a baby puts their health at risk mentally, and it puts the child at risk because there's this woman who doesn't want a baby. Some will view it very literally as, if your baby is fine, then you're having a baby, or then perform an abortion. If the baby is at risk of its physical health. So it wasn't an easy thing to do by any standards, and as I said, a lot of luck involved with it. In 1962, 150,000 married women were taking the pill, but getting the GP to again prescribe that was difficult. These were big societal changes, and doctors weren't always forced to do what the law says, and there was a lot of morality still involved with this sort of decision making. Again, when you look at sexuality, which I think is a really important point, because I think it's still something that as feminists we still consider now, whether having sex and being able to express your sex freely is liberating, or whether it's falling into the male gaze. And yes, in the 60s there was a culture of, I view it as men taking advantage of women who want to express themselves in a sexy way. I think a lot of the calendars and the way women were printed is still extremely sexist, and this was made possible because of freedom in literacy and women wanting to display themselves sexually, but I still think it wasn't done very tastefully, and I think it still felt very much in a way of women serving the patriarchy. This is a big issue and a big topic that is still very much relevant today, on whether being sexually liberated and selling photos of your body, etc., what is that playing into? In the 60s, you had the things of like page-free girls, and I feel uncomfortable with the way in which these subjects were tackled in papers during this decade. Again, people may disagree with me, I understand. Siegel, for example, doesn't deny the sexism that is often involved with these publications and soft porn mags, but says it shouldn't take away from the liberation of women to express themselves sexually. However, if you look at like popular figures like Sophia Loren, a sex symbol of the decade, she had a baby, and if you look at the newspaper post, if you look at the newspaper coverage of her having a baby, it's like she's even more beautiful for having becoming a mother. Being a mother was still very much what women are supposed to do. Being sexy whilst doing it, fantastic, but also, yeah, be a mother. The period saw the Mrs. pageant contests and advertisements show women in the home with all these new electrical appliances, but which is also something interesting to look about. Maybe I'll do a video on this one day, but I once, in an economics class, watched a video on why the washing machine is one of the most important inventions, and things like the invention of supermarkets and all these kitchen appliances and household appliances meant that women could go out to work more. I don't think it was true on a very wide scale thing, because you have to be quite middle class in order to afford all these appliances. But it was a step in that you didn't housework and washing, like washing clothes, didn't take all day anymore. It could be done on an evening if you went out to work. So still very much transitioning. I wouldn't say it was 100% swinging or 100% not. I think there was a shift, but I can't overlook the sexism that accompanied these developments. Race. So, why are we terrible as human beings? After the war, Britain was a bit stuck. We needed to rebuild everything, and part of that was the NHS. Advertising to people in different parts of the Commonwealth to come and work in Britain. And with these immigrants, racial tensions grew. A common sight to see in windows were no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, which obviously is horrible and horrific to see. And Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech again amped up this anti-immigration sentiment and racist sentiments within Britain, especially among working class white men who felt like they were taking away their jobs, but they weren't. Riots such as the Notting Hill riots again reaffirms that there were racial tensions during this time, and how can you consider a period swinging if people are going to be harmed due to the race of their, due to the colour of their skin? Again, it is a big topic, and I do wish to talk about it in the future, especially when you overlook things like the civil rights movement in America, for example, and the issues of decolonisation that was happening with Britain's dismantling of the empire. It probably is a video I want to go further into depth with, because I don't think I've researched it enough, and I don't think it really do justice to, in this video, fully discuss everything. But in terms of the question that we're looking at of is the swinging 60s swinging, racism still very much a thing. So can we call a period swinging? And is it helpful to see things as a golden age if people don't have rights? My personal answer, no. There is this memorabilia and nostalgia created around the 60s, and I'm not sure whether that's just because of the generation I grew up in. Obviously, baby boomers still very much a thing. There is a market to tap into in terms of nostalgia. I'm sure I'll get one with austerity and COVID memorabilia, fun. But there is like a very nostalgic sense with the 60s. There are always shows, people saying that it had the best music and it was like a great time to be alive, and very much like a golden age status is put on the 60s. It is interesting that it is a time where people were fighting for their rights, but the fact that people do have to fight for rights that we would consider so basic today really shows that it was not a swinging time. I think giving it this title does danger in overlooking horrific parts of our past and Britain's past in that decade. How can you say that, yes, the decade saw a rebuilding of homes, but those homes were denied to Black people and Irish people. To overlook it as a time that is purely swinging is to not, I think, is damaging to us today, because obviously racial tensions haven't gone away. I think in 2020, the resurfacing of and refocus on Black Lives Matter really shows that it's so important with history to not overlook these issues and to not have it as a footnote. And I feel like I maybe have done it as a footnote, but I don't think it is good enough at all to be like, this happens, but then also racism. Like, it's a very important part. Like, why do we do history if it's not to help us understand and contextualize our world today? And currently what we need to learn from the 60s is that communities were given less rights and were taken advantage of. And again, if you look at women, and it's scary to think that I might not be able to access abortions, that is something that can change. And with history, I think it's important to see why communities are built up in the way that they are, and why sentiments exist. Pal's speech, I don't think that sentiment's completely gone. I think it's something that's still there, and you need to look at it in the face in order to overcome it as a society. So, in terms of giving an adjective to a period, I grew up with horrible histories. They give a title to everything. That is, the books are called the Rotten Romans, the Terrible Tudors, Gorgeous Georgians, and I don't think it's inherently wrong to describe a period with one overarching sentiment. Isolating and exaggerating a period simplifies history, and I think that is an important use of history. I don't think I could sit here and tell you one of my academic essays, but it's not the most useful way, and it's not the most broad way in which history is going to be interpreted. So creating a simplified version of history is very important, and if describing a time with an adjective and a very and perpetuate a vibe that is there, and it helps understand our trajectory as human beings, then I don't think it's inherently wrong. So in terms of the 60s, it was less conservative than the 1950s, and these ideas of that we can consider swinging were brought into the mainstream. As I said, the music, the fashion, it's all very swinging 60s, because women were fighting for their rights to vote, and because there was increased immigration, and a new Britain was emerging, and swinging is reflective of that. However, with doing this, areas that wouldn't necessarily fit into this narrative can be overlooked, or, as I said, just reduced to a footnote of, yes, but let's hold our horses a minute, this was a bit different than the whole idea I've been pushing forward. There is throughout history, there are people who think they've been born in the wrong generation, or there was a golden age that they lived through, or every presidential candidate looking back and being like, I want it to be like this time, and it's never just we can't have our own time because the past was so much better, clearly. And in doing that, we are not giving a accurate view of history, and I'm not necessarily concerned with giving an accurate view of history as such. It's more, what is that history then being used for? As I said, I think the most important parts of the 60s, if we are to remember, like, really important parts, is like people trying to get more rights, and it's really important in contextualizing the patriarchy, the racism in society today. However, that is often overlooked for the nicer parts of the decade, which, again, I don't think we shouldn't not look at those parts. I enjoy those parts, the youth culture and the music and the fashion. But my fear is that if we are happy enough to look at these periods with such narrow lens views, with such a narrow lens, and making it easy to be nostalgic of a period, then what's that going to say about our time and our generation? I don't want Black Lives Matter to be a footnote in here. To conclude, were the swinging 60s swinging? Yes and no, obviously. In terms of my personal opinion, I don't feel like it is necessarily wrong to call the swinging 60s swinging. It was a term that was coined during that decade, which again can tell you a hell of a lot about their time and what they felt like was different within their generation compared to others. However, saying that the 60s as this one decade is just siphoned off from the rest of history, not very helpful. And the practice of overlooking discrimination and hardship is really troubling and is something that we shouldn't do. But also the Beatles, so who knows? So I'll leave in the script description below all the reading that I did, and if you have access to them, as well as any other resources I can find. This is obviously a new series, so you can tell me if you like this kind of format of a bit more chit-chatty, and not as essay based, but if you would prefer something that is a bit more essay focused, I can write out scripts. This was more done by bullet points and then talking about it, opposed to like a script and an essay research. I have done essays on this topic, but I thought I was more chit chat. But again, if you would prefer something that is a bit more structured, then yes, just let me know, or any other feedback that you have. And I hope you have an adequate rest of your day. Bye. Not sure why I did that. I don't like that. I'm not going to do that again.